The dawn came cold over the scrubland outside Silver Ridge, Nevada, and with it came a man no one expected to see again. He rode in slow, his silhouette dark against the orange sky, and in his arms he carried something small and still. By the time the sun broke full over the horizon, the town knew two things. The Apache girl who had vanished 3 weeks prior was alive, and the man who brought her back was wanted for murder in 2 territories. What nobody could explain was why he had come at all. A wanted man does not return to civilization with a witness in his arms. He does not ride toward the law when every road leads away from it. And he does not risk the noose to deliver a child who could not speak his name, could not tell his story, and whose people would never forgive what men like him had done. Yet there he was, and the question that would haunt Silver Ridge for years to come was not what he had done, but what he believed was worth dying for. Something about that morning never made sense. Something about the way he looked at the girl, the way he dismounted without fear, the way he waited as if he had always known this was how it would end. The story begins 3 weeks earlier, when the heat still clung to the desert floor like a living thing, and the town of Silver Ridge moved through its days with the slow inevitability of a place too tired to change. Silver Ridge sat at the edge of Apache country, a collection of wooden structures and canvas tents held together by commerce and compromise. It was a town built on silver veins that had run thin years before, sustained now by the railroad spur that brought goods and people through on their way to somewhere better. The people who remained were the kind who had nowhere else to go or nothing else to lose. They included merchants who extended credit they would never collect, miners who dug for hope in played-out claims, and drifters who stayed just long enough to forget why they had come. Among them was a man named Caleb Frost, though few in Silver Ridge knew him by that name. He had arrived 4 months earlier, quiet and unremarkable, taking work where he could find it. He mucked stables for the livery, hauled freight for the general store, and kept his head down in a way that suggested he understood the value of being forgotten. He was tall and lean, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that spoke of years under open sky. His hands were scarred in the way of men who had worked hard and fought harder. He never drank in the saloon, never played cards, never started conversations he did not need to finish. The owner of the livery, an older man named Porter, appreciated that Caleb showed up when he said he would and did not ask for advances on his pay. Porter had seen enough men pass through to recognize the type. Caleb was running from something, but then again, most people were. As long as he worked steady and did not bring trouble, Porter was content to let the past stay buried. The town kept an uneasy peace with the Apache bands that moved through the territory. There had been bloodshed in years prior, raids and reprisals that left scars on both sides, but a fragile understanding had settled over the region. The Apache avoided the town, and the town avoided the Apache. Occasionally, small groups would come in to trade, tense exchanges conducted in silence and suspicion, but violence had become rare enough that people had begun to believe it might stay that way. That belief died the morning Rosa Delgado came running into the town square, her voice breaking as she called for help. Rosa worked as a laundress and sometimes as a translator when Apache women came to trade. She lived in a small adobe house on the eastern edge of town with her sister and her sister's daughter, a girl named Ayana. The girl was 8 years old, half Apache through her father, who had died 2 years earlier in a rockslide. Ayana was a quiet child, serious and watchful, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's careful smile. She had been playing near the wash that morning, Rosa said, no more than 100 yards from the house. Rosa had gone inside to tend the fire, and when she came back out, Ayana was gone. The search began immediately. Men fanned out across the scrubland, calling her name, checking ravines and old mine shafts and any place a child might wander. They found her footprints in the dust near the wash, small and bare. but the trail vanished where the ground turned to hardpan and rock. Some said she might have fallen and hit her head, wandered off confused. Others whispered darker possibilities, that the land itself had taken her, or that something worse had happened, something no one wanted to name. Caleb joined the search without being asked. He moved through the hills with a practiced eye, reading the ground in ways that made Porter wonder where he had learned to track. But like the others, he found nothing. The desert had swallowed the girl whole. By nightfall, Rose's sister was inconsolable, and the men returned to town with empty hands and grim faces. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Hewitt, organized another search for the following day, but there was a heaviness in his voice that suggested he did not expect to find her alive. On the second day, a group of Apache riders appeared on the ridge to the north. They did not come closer, but their presence was noted, and it changed the nature of the whispers. Some in town began to suggest that the girl had been taken by her father's people, that they had come to claim her. Others argued that made no sense, that Ayana's mother was Mexican, and the Apache would have no cause to take her. But fear does not require logic, and the tension in Silver Ridge grew taut as a drawn bowstring. Caleb heard the talk but said nothing. He continued to search, ranging farther each day, moving through the empty places where most men would not go. Porter noticed that he carried a rifle now, and that he did not return until after dark. On the fourth day, a rancher found tracks near his water tank, boot prints and the marks of unshod horses. He brought the news to town with the certainty of a man who had decided what he believed. The Apache had taken the girl, he said, and if the law would not act, then the men of Silver Ridge would have to. Sheriff Hewitt tried to calm the situation, but the anger in town was a living thing now, fed by fear and old grievances. A group of men began to talk about riding out, about demanding answers, about taking action before the trail went cold. Hewitt told them they would start a war they could not win, but the words fell on stone. That night, Caleb disappeared. Porter discovered it the next morning when he came to open the livery. Caleb's bedroll was gone, along with his rifle and his saddlebags. One of the horses was missing, a sturdy roan mare that could cover rough country. Porter shook his head. Hewitt walked to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a stack of wanted posters. He shuffled through them slowly, then stopped and laid one flat on the desk. The sketch was rough, but the resemblance was undeniable. The name beneath it read Caleb Frost, wanted for murder in Arizona territory and suspected in the deaths of 2 prospectors in California. The reward was $500. Hewitt looked up at Porter, his face unreadable. Porter opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He did not know what Caleb was or was not. He only knew that the man had worked hard, kept quiet, and now had vanished the same night the town was ready to boil over into violence. The question no one could answer was whether he had run to save himself, or whether he had gone looking for the girl. The days that followed were tense and strange. The group of men who had wanted to ride out hesitated now, unsure whether Caleb's flight meant guilt or something else. Sheriff Hewitt sent word to the territorial marshal, but help was days away at best. Rose's sister stopped eating, stopped speaking, and sat in her small house staring at the door as if willing her daughter to walk through it. On the 8th day, a trader came through town with a story. He had been camped near the foothills to the east when he saw a man on horseback, moving fast through the rocks. The man had been alone, the trader said, and he had been heading toward the old mission ruins where Apache families sometimes sheltered in the winter months. Hewitt gathered a small group and rode out to investigate, but they found the ruins empty. There were signs of recent fires, proof that people had been there, but whoever they were, they had moved on. Hewitt returned to town frustrated and uneasy, the kind of unease that comes from knowing a situation is slipping beyond control. On the 12th day, a drifter arrived in Silver Ridge with news that changed everything. He had been riding the northern trail when he spotted a camp in the high country, hidden among the pines. He had not gone close, but he had seen a man and a child through his spyglass. The man matched the description of Caleb Frost, and the child had dark hair and looked to be the right age. Hewitt organized a posse immediately. If Frost had the girl, whether he had taken her or found her, it did not matter. He was a wanted man, and he had answers the town needed. They rode out at first light, armed and ready for trouble, but they found nothing. The camp was gone, the ashes cold, the trail scattered by wind and time. It was as if the land itself was conspiring to hide them. Rumors began to circulate, strange and contradictory. Some said Frost had taken the girl to ransom her. Others said he was protecting her from something, though no one could say what. A few whispered that he was not the killer the posters claimed, that there was more to his story, but those voices were quiet and quickly drowned out. Rosa's sister grew weaker each day, her grief a weight that pressed the life from her. The town watched and waited, caught between hope and despair, and the question of what had really happened lingered like smoke. Then, on the morning of the 21st day, Caleb Frost rode back into Silver Ridge. He came alone, his horse moving slow and steady through the empty streets. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the dirt, and in his arms he held Ayanna, wrapped in a blanket, her small face pressed against his chest. She was alive, her eyes open, and though she looked thin and tired, she was whole. Frost did not run. He did not try to hide. He rode straight to the sheriff's office and dismounted, holding the girl carefully as if she were made of glass. Frost nodded slowly. Rosa came running, her face streaming with tears, and Frost handed the girl to her without resistance. Yana clung to Rosa, silent and trembling, and Rosa held her as if she would never let go. Frost complied, his movements calm, almost resigned. The cuffs clicked shut and Hewitt gestured toward the jail, but before they moved, someone in the crowd called out. Where was she? Frost turned his head, his eyes scanning the faces gathered around him. For a moment he seemed to consider the question, weighing what he would say and what he would keep to himself. Then he smiled, a small, sad curve of his mouth that held no joy. Hewitt pushed him forward, and the crowd parted to let them through. But as Frost walked toward the jail, Ayanna turned in Rosa's arms and looked back at him. Her dark eyes were wide and serious, and in them was something the people of Silver Ridge could not name, not fear, not gratitude, something else. Something that suggested the truth of what had happened in those 3 weeks was buried deeper than anyone knew, and that the man now walking toward a cell and a noose had carried more than just a missing girl out of the wilderness. He had carried a secret. And as the jail door closed behind him, the town began to ask the questions that would haunt them long after the dust settled. Why had he come back? What had he found? And why did the girl look at him not as a captor, but as something closer to a savior? The jail cell in Silver Ridge had not been built to hold a man like Caleb Frost for long. It was a simple structure, iron bars set into adobe walls, designed for drunks and drifters who needed a night to sober up. Sheriff Hewitt knew this, and so did Frost. What surprised everyone was that Frost made no attempt to leave. He sat on the wooden bench, his hands resting on his knees, and waited. When Rosa brought Ayanna to the window so the girl could see him, he smiled at her and told her she was brave. When the doctor examined him and found rope burns on his wrists and a poorly healed wound across his ribs, Frost offered no explanation. When Hewitt questioned him about where he had been, what he had seen, and who else had been involved, Frost answered in careful, measured words that revealed almost nothing. I found her in the hills, he said. She was alone and frightened. Frost met the sheriff's eyes. Hewitt leaned back in his chair, frustration creasing his face. "You wanted for murder in 2 territories. You disappear the same night a girl goes missing." Frost did not respond immediately. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "I don't expect you to believe anything. I brought her home. The territorial marshal arrived on the fourth day after Frost's return. His name was Pierce, and he carried the warrant from Arizona Territory along with a file that detailed the crimes Frost was accused of. 2 prospectors had been killed in a claim dispute near Tucson. Witnesses placed Frost at the scene, and a third man who survived the encounter had identified him by name. The evidence was strong enough for a hanging, Pierce said, and he intended to transport Frost back to face trial. But first, he wanted answers about the girl. Pierce was a methodical man, lean and gray-haired, with the kind of patience that came from years of tracking men through impossible country. He interviewed Rosa, who said Ayanna would not speak about what had happened. He interviewed the doctor, who confirmed the girl was malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. He interviewed the trader who had reported seeing Frost in the foothills, and the drifter who claimed to have spotted the camp in the high country. The stories did not align. The trader said Frost had been moving fast, as if fleeing. The drifter said the camp looked settled, as if they had been there for days. Yanna's condition suggested she had been cared for, not neglected, yet Frost's injuries indicated he had been in a fight or an accident. No. On the 6th day, Pierce made arrangements to transport Frost to Arizona. The plan was to leave at dawn, travel light, and avoid the main roads where sympathizers or opportunists might cause trouble. Hewitt agreed to accompany them as far as the territorial line, and a deputy named Larson was assigned to ride along as an extra gun. That night, the town held its breath. Rosa's sister, weak and frail from weeks of grief, finally began to eat again. The relief in Silver Ridge was palpable, but it was undercut by a growing unease. People had expected answers, closure, some kind of resolution that would let them return to their lives. Instead, they had a silent girl, a taciturn prisoner, and more questions than they had started with. Some in town began to argue that Frost deserved leniency. He had brought the girl back, after all, when he could have disappeared into the wilderness and never been seen again. Others insisted that sentiment was irrelevant. He was a wanted man, and the law was the law. The argument spilled into the saloon, the general store, and the church steps, dividing the town in ways that would take years to mend. Porter, the livery owner, visited Frost the night before his departure. Frost considered the question. Frost leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "You ever have something you needed to make right, Porter?" They sat in silence for a while, and then Porter stood and tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, Frost." The next morning, as the sky began to lighten, Marshal Pierce and Sheriff Hewitt prepared to leave. Frost was brought out in cuffs, his belongings packed in a saddlebag, and his horse saddled and ready. A small crowd had gathered to watch, their faces somber and uncertain. Rosa stood at the edge of the crowd, holding Yanna's hand. Yanna reached Frost and wrapped her arms around his leg. She did not speak, but she pressed her face against him and held on tight. The girl nodded, her dark eyes glistening. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into his hand. Frost closed his fingers around it and nodded. Rosa came forward and gently led Ayanna back, and the girl did not resist, though she did not look away from Frost until he was out of sight. They rode east, toward the territorial line, and by mid-morning Silver Ridge was a memory behind them. But they never reached Arizona. 2 days into the journey, as they made camp in a narrow canyon, a group of riders appeared on the ridge above them. There were 6 of them, rough men with hard eyes, and they came down the slope with rifles drawn. Pierce recognized the leader, a man named Good who ran with a gang that preyed on travelers and supply wagons. "That's far enough," Pierce called out, his hand moving to his sidearm. Good grinned. "Trial's a long way off," Good said. The gunfight that followed was brief and brutal. Hewitt took a round in the shoulder and went down hard. Larson managed to fire twice before he was hit in the chest and fell silent. Pierce killed one of the gang members and wounded another, but the numbers were against him. Good's men closed in, and Pierce knew they were finished. Then Frost moved. Despite the cuffs, he lunged for Larson's rifle, rolled behind a rock, and fired. The shot took one of Good's men in the throat, and the man fell from his horse. Frost worked the lever and fired again, forcing the others to scatter. Pierce, bleeding from a graze across his temple, seized the moment and dropped another rider. Good cursed and called for a retreat, and the remaining gang members turned and rode hard for the ridge. By the time the dust settled, 3 of Good's men were dead, and the rest were gone. Hewitt was conscious but in pain, clutching his shoulder. Larson was not breathing. Frost looked at the cuffs on his wrists, then at Hewitt, then at the empty horizon. They buried Larson in the canyon and patched Hewitt as best they could. Pierce made a decision then, one that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "I'm saying you can leave. Head into the hills, disappear. I'll report that you escaped during the attack." "You're a fool," Pierce said, though there was no anger in his voice. They rode on, slower now, and reached the territorial line 2 days later. Pierce arranged for Frost to be held in a more secure facility while arrangements were made for the trial. But word of what had happened in the canyon spread quickly, and the story changed with each telling. Some said Frost had fought like a demon, saving the lawmen from certain death. Others said he had orchestrated the ambush himself, that the whole thing was a plan to escape. A few claimed that Good's gang had been after something Frost carried, something valuable he had found in the hills with the girl. The contradictions piled up like stones, and the truth became harder to see. The trial in Arizona was delayed. Witnesses failed to appear. The man who had identified Frost recanted his testimony, then disappeared entirely. The case began to fall apart, piece by piece, until the judge ruled there was insufficient evidence to proceed. He rode west, and somewhere along the way he vanished. The years that followed were strange and unsettled. Silver Ridge returned to its slow rhythms, but the questions remained. Rose's sister recovered, though she never spoke of those weeks when Ayanna was gone. The girl grew older, quieter, and more distant, and those who knew her said she carried a sadness that never quite left. Porter continued to run the livery, and he never hired another hand he did not know by reputation. Sheriff Hewitt retired after his shoulder failed to heal properly, and he spent his remaining years sitting on his porch, watching the horizon as if expecting someone to ride in. Frost was spotted occasionally, or so people claimed. A rancher near Santa Fe said he had seen a man matching his description working a cattle drive. A merchant in El Paso swore he had sold supplies to a quiet stranger who looked like the sketch on the old wanted poster. A prospector in Colorado told a story about a man who had helped him through a snowstorm, a man with scars on his hands and a way of speaking that suggested he had carried heavy burdens. But none of the sightings were confirmed, and none of the stories were quite the same. In Silver Ridge, the legend grew. Children whispered about the man who had saved the Apache girl, the outlaw who had faced down killers and walked away. Some said he was a ghost now, haunting the hills, watching over lost children. Others said he had gone south to Mexico and started a new life where no one knew his name. Porter kept the small object Ayanna had given Frost, found later among his belongings when the marshal's office sent them back. It was a carved stone, smooth and black, with a symbol etched into its surface. Porter did not know what it meant, but he kept it in a drawer behind the counter, and sometimes he would take it out and turn it over in his hands, wondering. Decades passed. Silver Ridge shrank as the railroad rerouted, and the silver stayed buried. Rose's sister died, and Rosa followed not long after. Yana left town when she was 16, and no one knew where she went. The jail where Frost had been held was torn down, and the land was sold to a family that built a general store on the site. The story faded, as stories do, until it was little more than a footnote in the county records. An unsolved mystery, a fugitive who disappeared, a girl who never spoke of what she had seen. But in the spring of 1973, a historian researching territorial law enforcement came across a file in the state archives. It was labeled simply Frost, Caleb, Wanted, 1882. And inside were the old wanted posters, the marshal's reports, and a letter written by Sheriff Hewitt years after his retirement. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, as if Hewitt had written it simply to put his thoughts to paper. In it, he described the events surrounding Frost's capture and release, and he ended with a single paragraph that the historian found himself reading over and over. I do not know if Caleb Frost was a good man. I know he was wanted, and I know he carried violence in his past. But I also know he could have run, and he did not. He could have let that girl die, and he did not. Whatever else he was not the man the law believed him to be. I think about that sometimes, on the nights when sleep will not come. I think about the choices a man makes and what they cost him, and whether redemption is something that can be earned or only given. I do not have answers. I only have the memory of a man who walked into a jail cell knowing what waited for him, and the face of a child who looked at him like he was the only safe thing in a dangerous world. The historian made copies of the file and began to dig deeper. He tracked down descendants of the people involved, searched old newspapers, and corresponded with other researchers. Slowly, a fuller picture began to emerge. There was a report from a priest in New Mexico who had recorded the confession of a dying man in 1891. The man, whose name was not given, spoke of crimes he regretted and a girl he had helped save in the Nevada territory. The details matched. There was a photograph found in an estate sale in Colorado, dated 1902. It showed a group of ranch hands standing in front of a barn, and in the back row, partially obscured, was a man with the same lean build and scarred hands described in the marshal's reports. There was a letter discovered in a collection of Apache oral histories, dictated by an elderly woman who remembered a white man who had brought a lost child back to her people before returning her to the town. She said the man had been kind and that he had carried sorrow like a stone. The pieces did not form a complete picture, but they suggested something the historian found compelling. Caleb Frost had not vanished into legend. He had lived, quietly and deliberately, in the margins of the frontier, and he had tried, in whatever way he could, to make right the things he had done wrong. The historian published his findings in a small academic journal, and the story made a brief appearance in a regional magazine. A few people in what remained of Silver Ridge read it with interest, and some of the older residents remembered hearing their grandparents speak of a man named Frost and a girl who never spoke of what she had seen. And in a nursing home in Phoenix, a woman in her 90s sat in a chair by the window and listened as her granddaughter read the article aloud. The woman did not say much, but when the granddaughter finished, she reached into a drawer beside her bed and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. It was a carved stone, smooth and black, with a symbol etched into its surface. The granddaughter asked what it was, and the woman smiled, a small, sad curve of her mouth that held a lifetime of silence. "A promise," she said softly. The granddaughter leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the carved stone resting in her grandmother's weathered palm. Outside the nursing home window, Phoenix sprawled beneath a copper sky, a city built where desert used to be. "What kind of promise?" she asked. The old woman, Yana, though she had gone by Anna for most of her life, turned the stone slowly between her fingers. Her hands were spotted with age, the joints swollen, but her grip was steady. She had not held this object in years, had kept it wrapped and hidden in drawers that moved with her from house to house, through marriages and children and all the accumulated weight of a long life. But she had never forgotten what it meant. She closed her eyes, and the years fell away like dust. The historian's article had been accurate in its facts, but incomplete in its understanding. It had traced the outline of events, connected fragments across decades, but it could not know what had happened in those 3 weeks in the hills, because only 2 people had witnessed it, and one of them had never spoken of it until now. Gianna, Anna, had been 8 years old when she wandered from the wash behind her aunt's house. She had not been taken. She had followed a rabbit into the scrubland, curious and unafraid, and by the time she realized she was lost, the sun was high and the familiar shapes of home had vanished behind ridges that all looked the same. She had tried to find her way back, but the land twisted and doubled, and soon she was walking in circles, her throat dry, her legs trembling. She found shade beneath an overhang of rock and waited for someone to come, but no one did. Night fell, cold and absolute, and she huddled against the stone, fighting sleep because her mother had once told her that children who slept alone in the desert sometimes did not wake up. On the second day, she heard voices, men, speaking in low tones, moving through the ravine below. She almost called out, but something in their manner stopped her. They were searching, but not for her. They carried rifles and moved with the tension of people who expected trouble. She stayed hidden and watched them pass. It was on the third day that he found her. She had been trying to climb down from the rocks, hoping to reach a dry creek bed where she thought she might find water. Her foot slipped, and she fell, tumbling down the slope in a shower of loose stone. When she stopped, her ankle was twisted and pain shot through her leg like fire. She tried to stand and fell again, crying now, the tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. That was when she saw him, a man standing at the edge of the ravine watching her. He was tall and lean, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, and he carried a rifle slung across his back. She stared at him, her breath coming in short gasps. He examined her ankle without touching it, then looked back the way she had come. She told him haltingly about the rabbit and the wash and the voices she had heard. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. "Those men," he said, "not looking for you." He told her his name was Caleb, and that he had been living in the hills for several weeks, avoiding people who wanted to hurt him. He did not explain why, and she did not ask. She was 8 years old, and the world of adult troubles was distant and incomprehensible. All she knew was that her ankle hurt and she was thirsty, and this man had given her water. "I can take you back," he said, "but those men are watching the trails. If they see us, they'll come." She looked at him, at the weariness in his eyes, and she understood in the way children sometimes do that he was telling the truth. "Then we hide," she said. He smiled, a brief flicker of warmth. "All right." They moved deeper into the hills, traveling slowly because of her ankle. Caleb fashioned a splint from branches and strips of cloth, and he carried her when the ground was too rough. They camped in places where the rocks formed natural shelters, and he showed her how to find water in the damp earth beneath certain plants, how to listen for the movements of animals, how to stay quiet and still when danger was near. The men hunting him, she learned later they were part of a gang led by a man named Good, who believed Caleb had stolen gold from a claim they considered theirs, came close several times. Once they passed within 50 yards of where Caleb and Iana lay hidden beneath a ledge, their breathing shallow, his hand resting lightly over her mouth to keep her silent. She could hear the men talking, their voices rough and angry, and she pressed herself against Caleb's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. When the men moved on, Caleb let out a long breath. Brave," he whispered. She shook her head. As the days passed, she began to understand him better. He was careful with his words, but in the quiet hours he told her small pieces of his story. He had been a prospector once, and before that a soldier. He had made mistakes, hurt people he should not have hurt, and now he was paying for it. The men chasing him wanted him dead, and the law wanted him hanged, and there was nowhere left to run. "Then why don't you just leave?" she asked. On the 15th day, they saw smoke rising from the valley below. That night, as they sat beneath a sky dense with stars, Ayanna asked him why he had helped her. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, creased and faded. It showed a young woman holding a baby, both of them smiling. "My wife," he said, "and my daughter. They died of fever 6 years ago. I wasn't there." He folded the photograph and put it away. "When I saw you on those rocks, hurt and alone, I thought about her, my daughter. I thought about what I would want someone to do if she had been lost and afraid." He looked at Ayanna, his eyes steady. "I can't bring them back." She did not fully understand the weight of what he was saying, but she felt it, a heaviness that settled between them like a promise. On the 18th day, Caleb made a decision. The supplies were running low, and Ayanna's ankle, though healing, was not strong enough for the kind of travel they would need to evade the men below. If they stayed in the hills much longer, they would both die. If he tried to take her to the nearest town, Good's men would see them. He shook his head. "You need a doctor, you need your family." She tried to argue, but he was resolute. They left the hills in the early hours of the morning, moving carefully through the shadows. Good's men did not see them, or if they did, they chose not to follow. By the time the sun rose, Silver Ridge was visible on the horizon, and Caleb's fate was sealed. When he rode into town with her in his arms, Ayanna had wanted to scream, to tell everyone that he was good, that he had saved her, that they could not take him away. But her voice would not come. The fear and exhaustion and the weight of everything she had seen had locked her throat, and all she could do was hold the carved stone he had given her the night before. "Keep this," he had said, "and remember that sometimes the worst things we do don't define us." Anna opened her eyes and looked at her granddaughter, who was watching her with a mixture of wonder and sadness. "Did you ever see him again?" the girl asked. Anna shook her head. "Not in person, but I followed his story. After he was released, I tried to find him. I asked travelers, sent letters, hired a man to search. I never found him, but I heard things. Stories from people who said they had met a man who matched his description. A ranch hand in New Mexico who saved a family from a flash flood." She smiled faintly. "I don't know if all those stories were true, but I think some of them were." The granddaughter looked down at the stone, then back at her grandmother. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone? The law thought he kidnapped you." "Because the truth wouldn't have changed anything," Anna said quietly. "He was still a wanted man. He still had blood on his hands. What I could have said would not have erased that. But what he did for me, what he sacrificed, that was his choice to make." She closed her fingers around the stone. "He told me that night before we left the hills that some debts can't be paid in courtrooms or with words. They're paid in actions, in choices made when no one is watching." Anna was quiet for a long time, then she nodded. "Yes." The historian's article had sparked renewed interest in the story, and in the months that followed, others began to search for answers. Descendants of people who had known Caleb Frost came forward with letters and diaries. A great-grandson of Marshal Pierce shared a journal entry in which the marshal wrote that releasing Frost had been the hardest and most right decision he had ever made. A woman in New Mexico contacted a local newspaper, claiming her great-grandmother had been saved from a robbery by a man named Caleb in 1903. The pieces continued to accumulate, and slowly a portrait emerged. Not of a villain or a hero, but of a man who had carried his guilt like a shadow and had spent his remaining years trying to cast a little light. No one ever found definitive proof of when or where Caleb Frost died. The records were incomplete, the trails cold. But the consensus among those who studied his story was that he had lived into his 70s, moving through the frontier quietly and deliberately, leaving behind small kindnesses and carefully chosen actions. In Silver Ridge, which by then was little more than a historical footnote, a group of residents raised funds for a modest memorial. It was not for Caleb Frost, but for all the forgotten people who had passed through the town in its heyday, the drifters and laborers and dreamers who had built something in the desert and then moved on. But when the plaque was unveiled, someone had etched a small symbol at the bottom, almost hidden among the decorative flourishes. It was a circle with a line through it, the same symbol carved into the black stone Yana had carried for 90 years. No one officially acknowledged what it meant, but those who knew, knew. Anna passed away 3 months after the article was published, peacefully in her sleep. Her granddaughter inherited the stone, and with it, the story. She kept both close, and when her own children were old enough, she told them about a man who had saved their great-grandmother, and about the promise that had been kept across a lifetime. The story did not become famous. It did not inspire books or films or grand monuments. It remained what it had always been, a quiet truth held by a few, passed down through whispers and worn photographs and objects wrapped in cloth. But in the way that such stories do, it endured. And on certain nights, when the wind moves through the hills east of where Silver Ridge used to stand, people who live in the scattered ranches and small towns nearby say they sometimes see a figure on horseback, moving slowly through the scrub. They say he is looking for something or someone and that he has been searching for more than a century. No one believes it, of course. Ghosts are the province of campfire tales and the imaginations of children, but the story persists, and in its persistence there is a kind of truth. Not the truth of what can be proven or measured, but the truth of what is remembered, the truth of choices made in darkness and carried into light, the truth of debts that can never be fully paid but can, perhaps, be honored. And if that is not redemption, it is something close enough. The desert keeps its secrets. The wind erases footprints. The years turn memory into legend and legend into dust. But some things remain, carved into stone and carried forward, and in the carrying they become real again. A man who ran and then stopped running. A girl who was lost and then found. A promise made in the hills and kept across a lifetime, and in the end that was enough.